Hello, and welcome back to the Building the New World Conference. Tonight, we're doing Sector 10, which is Science and Technology, and with me is Robin Hanson, a professor of economics at George Mason University and a research associate at the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University in England. He's known for his work on idea futures and helped create the Foresight Institute's Exchange and DARPA's Future Map project. He invented market scoring rules that are used by prediction markets such as the consensus point, where he is the chief scientist. He also is credited with originating the concept of the policy analysis market for betting on developments in regions such as the Middle East. Robin received a bachelor's degree in physics and a master's in physics and conceptual foundations of science. His doctorate is in social science from Caltech. He has researched artificial intelligence, Bayesian statistics, and hypertext publishing at Lockheed, NASA, and elsewhere. He also created and supports a proposed system of government called Futurarchy, which maybe we can ask him about later. His book, The Age of Ems, is on brain emulation and its eventual impact on society. His most recent book, The Elephant in the Brain, looks at uncovering individual and societal mental blind spots. Welcome, Robin. We are pleased to have you at the 2020 Building the New World Conference.
I'm happy to be here and sad that I can't see you guys all, but I'm going to try to imagine you. I guess we're waiting to see the slides, and then we'll get going. So next. In this talk, I'm going to have 4 sections. First, I'm going to tell you about automation in the very near past and near future and tell you that not much is actually happening there. Then I'm going to tell you about how remote work is going to be a really big thing over the next 30 years, is my prediction. After that, I'm going to talk about this huge change that should happen in roughly a century called brain emulations. And then finally, I'm going to talk a bit about what might happen after brain emulations, where brain emulations and other kinds of minds mix together. Next. This is all of history in one graph. So on the x-axis, we have time, but it gets compressed as we get nearer to the near future here, logarithmically. And on the y-axis, we have the growth rate of whatever our ancestors were doing at the time. So, a 500 million years ago, animals started growing and their brains doubled roughly every 30 million years. And then around 2 million years ago, humans appeared, and humans started doubling roughly every 250,000 years. And then roughly 10,000 years ago, humans started to farm, and then human farmers doubled roughly every 1,000 years. And 200 or so years ago, the Industrial Revolution appeared. And since then, humans have been doubling our economy roughly every 15 years. Next. And you might wonder, could this happen again? Could we have yet another sudden jump to a much faster growth rate? In each of these previous jumps, we increased the growth rate of the economy by a factor of 60 to 300 within less than a previous doubling time. So if that were to happen again, then sometime roughly in the next century or so, within, say, a 10-year period, the economy would go from doubling now as it does every 15 years to doubling every month, or perhaps even faster. That's the sort of thing that might happen if we continue this trend. So what could possibly cause that? The obvious thing a lot of people have been thinking about lately is automation. Next. You may know that we're in a boom of concern about automation in the last decade, but you might not know that these booms of concern have happened over and over again for a long time. Starting back at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, there was a very big boom of concern about automation. And over the last century, we've seen booms roughly every 30 years. And at the moment, we're in another boom. Next. Is the economy about to suddenly explode and drastically change? Well, most of our measures suggest not. So for example, when we look at the stock market, we can definitely see how the mix of composition of different things in the stock market changed in the Industrial Revolution, but not much has been changing lately, as you might expect if investors thought there was a really big boom coming. Next. This is a list of the top 10 most automated jobs and the least 10 least automated jobs from a data set where 900 jobs are all listed in terms of which are how automated. A lot of people look at those highly automated jobs and say, that's coming for the rest of us. We're about to have this big boom of automation. And I've looked at a little data about that. Next. And the data I looked at can answer the following 3 key questions. It says, well, how well can we predict which jobs are how automated? Have the predictors of automation jobs changed much over the last 20 years? And when jobs get more or less automated, does that tend to make people get higher or lower wages or have more unemployment or employment? How does that affect the things people care about on their jobs? Next. You can't read these numbers, but this data just says basically we can predict which jobs are how automated actually really quite well with roughly 20 different parameters describing jobs. And these predictors of job automation have not changed in the last 20 years. So basically, there's not much happening in the world of automation. You've heard a lot in the news about all these big things, scary coming, but nothing's really happening. So I wouldn't expect much to happen over the next 10 or 20 years either. At least not different than we've seen over the last century. We've seen a lot of change over the last century, and that change will continue. Next slide. In addition, in fact, when jobs get more automated than they were, it doesn't actually have any effect on pay on average or on the number of employees at those jobs. There's fluctuations of those things, but they're just not correlated with whether jobs get more automated. So basically, I'm trying to tell you about job automation in the next few decades. Don't worry about it. Whatever we've been doing to handle the issue over the last century, it'll work fine over the next few decades. Next. So let's switch to the topic of remote work. Next. As you probably have experienced, we've had this huge boom in remote work in the last 6 months as this pandemic has spread and a lot of people have had to work from home. Over the previous decades, remote work was slowly growing, but it was still a pretty small fraction of the economy. But lately, we've really been pushed into it. After the pandemic's gone, we are going to retreat and go back to work in the office, but we will have gotten a taste of it. And I predict that over the next 30 years, remote work will really be a really big thing. A huge fraction of the economy will sort of move to remote work over the next 3 decades. Next. Not just remote work sitting in an office, but this is a picture from a video showing somebody basically stocking shelves at a convenience store using an avatar from a long distance. So we will, over the next 30 years, be able to do a lot of manual jobs with avatars. We will be able to do plumbing or even hairdressing or certainly being receptionists through these sorts of avatars. And that will allow a huge change in the world economy. Next. So better organization. So at the moment, as you may know, remote work is just difficult and it's difficult socially and organizations just haven't learned very well how to do it. But I think over the next 30 years, we will learn a lot about how to do that. And we'll also just make better avatars and better ways to control them so people can more flexibly, say, do something like plumbing through an avatar long distance. Doing things remotely will definitely create these data sets of how people do jobs, and that will help somewhat with automation. But honestly, automation will still be very difficult. But the key thing is that we will now merge a lot of local markets into continental or global markets. So today, your plumber has to be local. So there's a very local market for your plumbing. And so plumbers can't be very specialized because they have to be nearby and be able to come and do pretty much everybody's tasks nearby. But when people can do your plumbing from an avatar and they can be thousands of miles away, then very large regions of labor markets can become integrated and specialized and be as if they were just one large city together, that sort of level of specialization, which will produce enormous productivity gains. It will sort of equalize wages around these regions that are all doing the same sort of jobs by avatars. And it'll probably produce some large global firms that manage a lot of these workers, say a global plumbing firm. And these global plumbing firms and other firms will probably better able to resist each nation's regulations, just like today, say, Google or Apple does, because they're not just in one company, they're all over the world. Next. All right, so now I'm going to tell you about brain emulations. Remote work is something that will happen over the next 30 years, and that's enough for you guys to think about for in the near future. But now I'm going to talk about a century from now. Next. So again, we said, if you think about what could really radically change the economy, there are robots or automation comes to mind as something that has that potential. And so we think about how could you make really smart robots? There's several different approaches. One approach is obviously we just keep writing more better software like we've been doing for a long time. And if you ask people like how has that been going, they basically say that's going to take a long time to eventually get to human level abilities, maybe even centuries. Other people say, well, there's going to be this revolution where all of a sudden a lot of things change all at once, which could happen. I don't know. But I'm skeptical. I'm going to talk about a third approach, though. And the third approach is like porting software. So today, when you have old software that runs on a machine and you want software like that running on a new machine, one approach is to stare at the old software, try to guess how it works, and write software on the new machine that works how you think like it works on the old machine. But a different approach is to port the software. That is what you do is you write an emulator on the new machine that makes the new machine look like the old one to the software. If you can write an emulator, you can just move the software over without changing it, and it just works. So the idea is to do that for the human brain. Next. So to do that, we're going to need three things. Next. We're going to need lots of cheap, fast parallel computers. We have a lot of these things, but they're not cheap or fast enough yet. Number two, next. We're going to need to take individual human brains and scan them in fine spatial and chemical detail to see which kinds of cells are where connected to what. And next, we're going to need computer models of how each kind of brain cell works in terms of taking input signals, turning it into output signals, changing internal state. We have good enough models for each kind of cell. We have a good enough scan of a brain. We can put that all together to make a computer model of a particular brain. And if it's a good enough model, it has the same input-output behavior. That is, you talk to it, it talks back. You ask it to do things, it does things. Of course, this is after it's hooked up with artificial eyes, ears, and hands and mouth, so it can actually do things. And if you can do that and make that cheap enough, then everything changes. Next. So I wrote this book called The Age of Ems, Work, Love, and Life When Robots Rule the Earth. It came out in 2016. I have a TED Talk that you can see about it. It's had 1.5 million views. And I'm going to tell you now some of the major features from this book, but I'm not going to be able to tell all of it. So if you want to learn more, take a look at the book. Next. This is an effort to describe an entire future civilization. So I have to draw on lots of different areas of academia. This is actually a map of academia, all the different areas connected when they cite each other a lot. Next. The areas that are colored here are all the areas that I've specialized in my life, and I've drawn from all of them in order to write this book. So it's not all of academia, but it's a big chunk of it. And so that's allowed me to really take a broad view of this world. Next. What I'm going to do is go through, describe this entire civilization, all the different aspects of it. Each one, I'm going to pick the low-hanging fruit. That is, I'm going to take the, Econ 101, Chemistry 101, whatever 101 is, the very simplest conclusions, draw them, and then when something starts to get complicated, just go on to the next thing. Next. And I'm going to do what theorists do everywhere, which is to look for my keys under the lamppost. That is, we don't have data about the future. The only way we can talk about the future is to use our theories that we've inferred from the past to make predictions about the future based on our theories. So I'm using as many different, basic theories as I can from lots of different areas. And what we do in theory is we, simplify as much as necessary in order to be able to draw conclusions. And that's just what I've done here. Next. So to summarize my method, and then I'm going to start to tell you conclusions. I'm not trying to be original other than by asking a weird, unusual question. I'm going to just try to rely on academic consensus on each areas I look at. I'm not going to talk about what should be. I'm just going to try to guess what's likely to happen, whether I like it or not. So it's not going to try to make an entertaining story, a dramatic, dialogue. I'm just trying to predict what's likely to happen. I'm going to focus on these brain emulations, and I'll tell you why when we get into it. The humans are going to be more in the background, although they'll be there, and we'll have some things to say about them. I'm not trying to describe the entire future forever, for trillions of years. I'm only trying to describe that red line in that early graph, the next era after ours. That's as different from our eras as ours is from the past eras. There's probably going to be future eras after that. And I'm going to try to talk at that at the end of the talk. But for this section, I'm just focused on this era. I'm focused on in the middle of this era, after things have settled down, transitions are harder to predict. I'm going to use our standard econ tools of thinking about a competitive, low regulation scenario. That's not because I'm saying there shouldn't be regulation, just it's the way we usually do analysis. I'm going to focus on these brain emulations, and I'm going to simplify them. They're going to be relatively opaque. So what can you do with them? You can copy them. You can run them fast or slow. You can erase them. But you can't really look inside them. You can't take one person's musical ability and mix this with somebody else's sports ability or something like that. You can just turn these things on and turn them off and run them fast and slow. So that's my methods and my assumptions. And now I'm about to tell you about the Age of Ems. Next. All right, so this is what you might look like in virtual reality. That is, if you were in virtual reality and other people were looking at you, this is what you might look like, kind of doofy, wearing a mask. But next. What you might see in virtual reality is a beautiful, vivid world. You might, if you had enough interaction and tools, you might be able to smell the fresh sea air. You might hear the seagulls above, feel the breeze on your cheeks. This is a virtual world. Next. You might want some tools. Next. So, for example, you might want tools to be able to make a phone call somewhere. Next. You might want to jump to a different virtual world. Next. You might want to spend money or handle your accounting. Next. Now, an emulation looks different than you. This is what you look like when you are in virtual reality, but an emulation looks like this. Next. They are sitting on a server rack somewhere. They are a computer program running on a computer. However, from their point of view, next, the world can look just as dramatic and vivid as virtual reality looks to you. In fact, it can look as vivid and real as your world around you now looks to you, because it doesn't have to wear funky goggles and get dizzy when it moves or something. And it has more things it can do in this world than you can. Next. For example, it can change its speed. The world around it seems to go too fast and it can't keep up. It can just speed up its mind, and then the world around it seems to get slower. Next. It can make a copy of itself. Next. And once it's a copy, it might need to be told, oh, you're the copy, because a moment before there was just one of us and now there's two of us and we were both have the same memories and everything. And now we start to diverge from different experience. Next. We could also archive ourselves, make archived copies and save it off so that if something should go wrong, we can always just pick up the backup. Next. And we can even move where our brain is staying in order to interact with other things. Next. So wherever our brain is, then we can interact very quickly and cheaply with everything that's near us there. If we move our brain somewhere else, then we can interact with things there. We need to know about that to be aware of where our brain is. But that's, of course, different than what we see in our virtual reality. Next. So emulations would be in computer hardware, in huge cities crammed full of computer hardware, probably near lots of cooling water to keep it cool. And emulations would all crunch together in a small number of very dense cities, leaving actually most of the Earth to for humans, because the Ems aren't that interested in the rest of the Earth. Next. So for a number of things, we can think about robots and understand how they're different from humans because they can be represented by computer files. That's this key point. So next. Robots can be immortal because computer files can be immortal. Now that's in principle. Today, houses and cars are in principle immortal in the sense that if you keep repairing them, they can last indefinitely, but we don't always keep repairing them. Similarly for emulations or any kind of robot, they are in principle, they could be immortal, but we may not bother, or nobody may bother to store them and save them to make them immortal. Next. Robots, because they can represent it as computer files, they can travel around the world at the speed of light because you can send a computer file around the world at the speed of light. You'll want to be careful about security to make sure someone doesn't steal a copy of you along the way, but that's a thing a robot can do because they're represented as computer files. Next. We today love nature, not only because it's beautiful, but in part because we know that if we accidentally kill nature, we'll probably die. We humans depend on nature. However, robots, once they're built in factories out of stuff made up in mines using sunlight and other forms of energy that they dig up, don't need nature. So robots, if they kill nature, they do not die. So robots may be less careful about nature. that's more up to other choices. Next. And finally, you can make copies of computer files. And that means you can make copies of robots. You can make copies easily. And that has a lot of implications. Next. Next. First, because copies can be made so quickly, you can have as many of these brain emulation robots, or any kind of robot, as you have hardware to stick them in. And so the faster you can crank them out of factories, the more of them you can have. So you can have a population of explosion of them. And so since you can probably grow the population of these things faster than the economy can grow, wages would fall down to subsistence levels. So we move back to a more of a Malthusian world where wages are near subsistence levels. Next. That makes the economy grow very fast. So today, the economic growth rates is limited by the fact that we can grow capital very quickly, but we can't grow labor very quickly. People just take a long time to grow and to make more of them. So once you can make substitutes for humans in factories, then the economy can grow much faster, and it could plausibly double every month, like the estimate I gave you at the beginning from the previous rate of increases. Next. If the economy is growing very quickly, and say doubling every month, then if it takes a year to get to Mars, that'll just seem like a crazy long opportunity cost time. We won't be very interested in space, even though they'd be much more capable of space while the economy is growing so fast. And so in fact, they really, again, move to a small number of very dense cities here on Earth and not even be very interested in going far away from those, just because time is at a premium because things are growing so fast. Next. So, as I said before, there are still humans in this world, but they quickly must retire. That is, very quickly, the emulations are just more cost effective than the humans at pretty much everything. And so the humans don't really have jobs. But the humans start out owning all the capital in this world. And so if the economy doubles every month, their capital can double every month. So humans who start out with any modest amount of capital can very quickly be rich, and therefore live comfortably and buy yachts and mansions and starships and whatever else they want to buy. However, of course, many people today don't actually own much more than their ability to work. It's really important that those people acquire some insurance or sharing arrangements or capital before this happens, so that they don't get stuck not being able to earn any money and having no other source of living. Now, some people wonder, why would the robots keep us around? You've probably seen all the movies where the robots decide they don't want to keep us around. Why not kill us off and take all our stuff? Why not? Well, think about, at the moment, we have retirees. There are retired humans in the world, and they no longer contribute to the economy by working. Why don't we kill them and take their stuff? It would be very disruptive, and people would wonder who's next. And so we mostly let retirees live off their wealth, even without killing them and taking their stuff. So humans could plausibly hope that as long as they have enough integration with the Ems in this transition and there's good feelings, that the humans, like retirees today, could be allowed to retire. The entire human race retires and live off their savings and not be killed and have their stuff taken. All right, next. So emulations are copies of humans, right? We take a human, we scan the brain, we make a computer model, and now that's an emulation. And now the emulation lives in a virtual reality and works in the virtual reality and does things there and lives their life there. Now, humans vary across a lot of different features, as you may all know. For example, we vary in how smart and hardworking we are. Emulations are copies of humans, but they're not copies of the average random human. The emulation economy is very competitive and hardworking, and the people who choose who to make copies of and who to train and who to scan in order to make emulations, those people will be eager for the ones that are the most profitable, that'll be the most productive, and so they will choose the ones that seem to be the most productive out of the humans. So if we look at this graph here, we see this distribution of red dots, which say is the distribution of what humans are like. And the red dot, the blue dots, excuse me, those are the emulations. Those are the best, basically. The emulation economy will focus on the best humans from the point of view of being the most productive in the emulation economy. So that means the typical emulation is as elite and capable as an Olympic gold medalist or a Nobel Prize winner or a billionaire, a Pulitzer Prize, an Oscar. The people in our world that we most celebrate and give our highest honors to, That level of capability, that's the typical level of capability of an emulation, because they are basically copies of the few most productive humans. Probably the few hundred most productive humans, those produce most of the emulations, because they're just going to have millions and millions of copies of those. Next. We know some things about how more productive people are different today than others, and so we can just use that to predict a lot of typical features of emulations and how they're different from humans today. They're going to be smarter, more conscientious, extroverted, agreeable, not neurotic. They're probably not going to sleep as much. They'll probably be married, religious, probably roughly middle age, because that's our peak productivity age. And these are basically what the emulations are like. Next. So these are typical emulation views. So because they live in virtual reality, they never need to feel pain or hunger or disease or grime. Their bodies can always be beautiful. Their environments can always look beautiful, because in virtual reality, it doesn't really cost anything more to have a beautiful, luxurious environment than to have a cheap, dingy one. So they have beautiful views. However, you'll notice that these are mostly views of desks. They are working most of the time because they have living at subsistence wages and they're very productive. Then they have to basically work most of the time so that they can just afford enough to be able to pay for their existence and pay to be able to work and exist. Next. You, when you were a child, perhaps, maybe you felt like you were a little different from other people around you, and maybe you had this following fantasy. You said, you know what? I wasn't really born on Earth. I was born on some other planet out there. And on that other planet, there were lots of other people just like me. Someday, those people from my planet are going to come back and take me back, and then I'm going to be around lots of people like me who get me, not like all these strange people around me now. Now, that's not true, of course, you know by now, and that's not going to happen. But for emulations, it is kind of true. That is, each emulation comes from a clan of copies of that same original human. And so that clan is a new unit of social organization. And all the other Ems in that clan are very much like you. That is, they have a similar personality, similar outlook on life, similar sort of skill set, that sort of thing. And that's this new unit of organization, the Em clan, is now something the Ems can use for finance and employment and for law and politics and all sorts of other, ways in which we need units of organization. The Ems can use these clans. Next. Now, probably the most traumatic thing that ever happened to humans in human history was the transition from foraging to farming, being hunter-gatherers and then being farmers and herders. That is, for 1 million years, humans were foragers, and we were roughly like animals in the sense of, when we did what was intuitive, it was roughly the right thing to do. We were in tune with nature. We lived in tight contact with nature. But then this new opportunity to become farmers showed up, and it was only because we had a lot of cultural plasticity as humans, ways to change our culture, that humans were able to become farmers. So it was a long, difficult transition, tens of thousands of years at least, to become farmers. But over this time, culture remade humans into farming-like humans. And as farming-like humans, our culture valued different things. So foragers, for example, are very egalitarian, but farmers have to put up with a fair bit of inequality in terms of classes. Foragers are relatively peaceful. Farmers had war. Foragers didn't own much property. Farmers had property and classes and inequality. Foragers have a lot of leisure and really into art and travel and don't own much property. And farmers are into owning property and into self-repression, even self-control. Farmers really think self-control is important. So that was a big change in humanity into creating these cultures with religion and conformity pressures to create the farmer sort of mentality, as you'll see in this list of things on the right side of the screen, which are different from the main features that you see on the left side of the screen. In the last few hundred years, we've had this remarkable transition that we've slowly been getting rich. And then as we've gotten rich, we've moved sort of back toward the forager mindset in many ways, at least outside of work. So at work, we're really kind of hyper farmers. We put up with more inequality and domination and being told what to do at work than even most farmers would put up with, honestly. But once we leave work, we have become more hyper foragers. And that explains a lot of trends over the last few centuries. trends toward more democracy, more promiscuity, less religion, more travel, less fertility. A lot of the major changes over the last few centuries, I think you can attribute to the fact that we've become more forager-like. And many people like that, and they look toward a future that becomes even more forager-like, even more egalitarian, even more leisure, even more art, even less war, for example. That's a nice vision. It's sort of a Star Trek vision of the future. My prediction, however, is that in the age of Em, that doesn't happen. Ems actually become more like farmers than they are like foragers, because they have need of something like religion and self-control to get them to interact in a new, strange world. And they need a lot of new social techniques and conformity pressures and cultural manipulation to get them to sort of live in a strange new world. So again, my job isn't to tell you what we want to hear, what we'd like to happen. My job is just to tell you what I think is likely to happen. I think we're likely to go back to more of a forager mindset, at least the Ems would. The humans off in the periphery who are living in the same world, they would, of course, continue to be more of a forager mindset. All right, next. So this is your life, this red line. As time goes on, you are one person who started, and then eventually you end. Now, Ems, because they can make copies, they can have a wider variety of lives. Next. This is an emulation who every day when they're ready for work makes a few copies of themselves who can do various other chores. Stand in line at the DMV, write a letter to the editor, whatever they're going to do is they do a separate task. At the end of the day, only one of the copies goes on to the next day to make many copies. Each of these extra copies, I call them a short term copy here, the spur. These little spurs, they are much more cost effective in terms of time, in the sense that for the mainline copy, it has to maybe work for 8 hours and then needs 16 hours of rest before they're ready to work another 8 hours. But the spur copies, when you turn them on, ready for work, they're all work. Next. This is a more opportunistic Em. This emulation made different copies of them for different purposes and wasn't very sure which would be in high demand. And the ones that turned out to be in more high demand, there were more copies made of those and less of the ones that were in less demand. Eventually, perhaps less all demand entirely, but a relatively opportunistic life that's somewhat hard to predict. Next. Now, this is an emulation designer. Today, if we design a movie or a theme park or something like that, what we usually have is one person with a main vision, but then that vision has to be shared with lots of other people who then implement the vision. And a lot of things get lost in translation. So the implementation of the vision doesn't always fit exactly with the core person's ideas. An emulation, however, they can have a vision and then break themselves into copies, each of whom then implements this grand vision together. And so emulations can actually create larger, more integrated designs for software and theme parks and movies and whatever else it is. Next. This is an emulation plumber. Every day when they're ready for work, they make 1,000 copies, each of whom does a few-hour plumbing job, and then one copy goes on to the next day. Objectively, this plumber is working well over 99% of the time, but subjectively, what they remember is a life of relative leisure. Every day they only had to work about 2 hours, and then they were free for the rest of the day. So you can see this ability to make copies but not take them all on to the future can change the difference between working all the time and feeling like you haven't been working that much at all. Next. So today we have many kinds of systems that sort of start out relatively simple and then get complicated and then get too complicated to take on. And then what we have to do is go back to something simpler. So in your body, there are what they're called stem cells. These are relatively simple, clean cells. And you make versions of these cells, copy them, and then you have all these complicated cells in your body. But then when you try to make a new creature, like have a baby, you go back to these stem cells and make copies of those so they can be nice, clean, simple cells. And that's also true in software today. For example, you make a large, complicated software system, and eventually it gets so complicated you kind of have to throw it away and go back to something simpler. Lots of simple systems are like that, and brains also seem to be like that in some sense. So brains start out simpler, and then over time, as they learn, they get more complicated. but they also get harder to change. And they basically, in the end, get, too hard to change. Old dogs can't learn new tricks. And so you want to replace them with younger versions. So that's what happens to emulations. So even though emulations are immortal, in fact, each individual emulation mind, as it learns over time and gains experience and gets good at things, that brain over time gets fragile and harder to learn and harder to generalize. And so eventually needs to be retired and replaced with younger versions. So in this diagram, you can see we keep going back and making a new copy of the youngest version of the emulation and training that to have a life and do different things. And so the key lesson here is that emulations will have a limited lifespan after which they need to retire and be replaced by younger versions of themselves. So even though they're immortal, they have a limited work life. Next. So again, this is you. You start and then you end. Next. This could be you if at the beginning of a party you took a drug that meant that you wouldn't remember that party the next day or ever after. That's what the dotted line is. Your memories are coming from that beginning of the party. And the memories you accumulate during the party, that will end. And at the end of the party, those memories will disappear and not be remembered ever after. I'm told people do this sort of something sometime, that they go through some sort of drug or something where they won't remember the party later. Now ask yourself, at the end of the party, do you say to yourself, oh my goodness, this is terrible, I'm about to die? Nobody will ever remember these memories I have now of what just happened at the party. You could say that in some sense, that's a way you could interpret the situation, but most of us would not interpret that. We would say, no, I will continue on tomorrow, but I won't remember what I did last night at this party. I won't die, I will just forget. You can forget, but not die. Next. Here's an emulation who splits off a short-term spur copy to do a short-term task, and then that spur copy will end at the end of doing that task. That spur copy could say to itself, I am a new creature who just got born. I have a limited lifespan and I will die very soon. I hate that, boo-hoo. That's again something that you could see, but I predict the emulations will not choose to see their lives that way. They will instead say, like the human at the party, this is a part of my life that I won't remember later, but still I will go on. Why will they say that? It's not because it's philosophically correct. It's just because that's the sort of attitude you would need to live in this world and get along with it. In order to be able to make these short-term copies that did a lot of useful things and be okay with that, this is the kind of attitude you need to have. And so I predict this is the attitude they will have, whether it's philosophically correct or not, because humans mostly choose the attitudes they need to have, not based on whether something's philosophically correct. Next. So even if you're okay with it, there'll be this issue if, say you are a friend of somebody and then they make a copy of themselves. Now, are you a friend with both copies or just with one of the copies? If it goes away, if one of the copies goes away, you're supposed to be sad. It'll be complicated when people who are connecting to each other socially make different numbers of copies and end together. So a simple solution to that is to take whole teams of Ems, all of which you say work together in some office and socialize together, make copies of the whole team. So then the whole team is made a copy of, and they still have all the same relationships within the team. And now the team will either end together or go on and make more copies together. And so that solves a lot of the complicated social issues of how do you deal with other creatures that you're interacting with when they split and make copies. Next. Now, today, celebrities are rare, and they would be rare in the M world. Their time is rare, so it's going to be hard today for you to get to have a personal conversation with a celebrity. However, in the M world, the celebrity can just make a copy of themselves, and you can talk to the celebrity's copy, and then that copy will end, and that's doable. Everybody can have a conversation with a celebrity. The hard part is to get the celebrity to remember your conversation afterwards. If you want to brag about your contact with a celebrity, it'll have to be bragging that they remembered you later on, not just that they split off a copy to talk to you for a while. But this feature of being able to split off copies who then end quickly can be used to allow emulations to trust their leaders in ways that we cannot. So, for example, as you may know, if your leader says, we must start a war with neighboring nation X because they did something terrible, And you, the citizen, says, well, what did they do? Why do we have to start a war? And what if the leader says, well, I can't tell you that. I'm sorry. There's a state secret there. And we need to keep some secrets. And I'm sorry, I'm just telling you, you got to go to war. And I can't really tell you why. That's, of course, not very satisfying. But sometimes your government tells you that they have secrets and they can't tell you why for things. That's less of a problem for emulations. And let's tell you how. So the way we do it here, according to this diagram here, so say, you want to know, hey, why should we start this war? You need to explain that to me. So what happens is we make a copy of you and we make a copy of the leader, and both of those copies go inside of what I call a safe, a secure environment where information doesn't come in or out. And inside that safe, the leader can explain to you the reasons for starting this war, and you can listen and ask questions. And at the end of your conversation, you decide, are you convinced? Is there a good reason to go to war or not? And you just send one bit out of the safe back to yourself. And when you send that bit, the safe ends and all its contents ends. And now outside the safe, the original you hears this one bit and it may say, yeah, there's a good reason to go to war. And you don't know why, but okay, the person inside the safe, that copy of me, that was just me, an hour ago. That person was convinced. So I guess I should be convinced because I believe myself. So that's the sort of thing emulations can do by the ability to make copies and then put these copies inside safes. Next. In your life, all of our human lives, we tend to have three main phases. There's an early part of life where we're mainly training. There's a middle part of life where we're the most productive. And then there's a later part of life where we retire. Next. Emulation have the same three phases, but they're structured a little differently. So for them, you can train a small number of copies and get the best trainee versions and then make many copies of the best trainee. So that allows you to put a lot more resources into training because you're training fewer emulations and training them more carefully. Then when it's time to retire, what you can do is retire them more slowly. So I told you emulations can run at different speeds, but I didn't tell you that when you make an emulation run twice as fast, it costs twice as much. But if you make it run twice as slow, then it costs half as much. So if you're not rich enough to be able to retire and have a full speed retirement at the same speed you were working, it's fine. You can just retire more slowly. And now the emulation retirees, they start to see the emulation world speed up around them. And they end up having an interest in the long run. Em retirees, just like humans, end up caring about the long run of the emulation society and having a pressure to keep stability and preserve the society over the long run. Next. So emulations, as I said, can run at different speeds. These different speeds can vary over an enormous range, probably from down to 1 billion times slower than humans up to 1 million times faster than humans, an enormous range. Emulations probably prefer to interact socially with other emulations who are at the same speed. So in fact, these Ems would split into different classes. There would be a class hierarchy of Ems who are running at different speeds. Next. The high speed Ems, they embody a lot of wealth because it costs a lot to run them fast. They host meetings because that makes sense for people to come to them. They know things first. They're more productive. They are basically, in all these sort of ordinary senses, higher status. This is a status hierarchy of Ems. Next. The slowest Ems, they tend to be retirees, and they are somewhat like the ghosts of our world. So as you may know, this concept of a ghost is to say all around us there are these creatures called ghosts. They used to be alive, but now they're not. They are not very aware of what's going on. They're not very interested in what we're doing. They are not very knowledgeable about anything to be worth talking to. But if you go through the right incantations, you could maybe talk to one and you could talk to a ghost. Well, that's what the slow emulations are like. They were once fast. Now they're slow, but they don't know much. They can't do much. And what's the point? You could talk to one if you want, but most people don't. Next. So in our world today, we get an enormous gain out of cities. We come together into these big clumps of things called cities where we all get together. And in these cities, we are much more productive. There we have some disadvantages, though. And one of the main disadvantages is traffic. As you double a city, you get more than double the amount of traffic. And that means that's one of the reasons we aren't all in one big city cramped in the entire Earth. We are spread across many cities. Next. However, emulations, when they're in a city, they can interact with other emulations in the city without actually sending their whole brain. They just can send the bits that represent the room they're in and how they're interacting. And so emulations find it much easier to interact with other emulations in the same city. That means they face this penalty of traffic much less, which is therefore emulations will get together into much larger, more denser cities. In fact, they might all be in one huge city or a half dozen cities. I can't be very sure, but emulations will cram together into a small number of very dense cities, which is part of why the humans will get most of the rest of the Earth, because the Ems don't want it. The Ems are so eager to get close to each other in these large, dense cities. And I do a rough calculation estimate of saying how fast will the typical M run, and my best guess is the typical emulation runs about 1,000 times faster than the typical human. That's based on a trade-off of, if you run much faster than 1,000 times, even over an ordinary city size, you get signal delays across the size of the city. And if you run much slower than 1,000 times, then you sort of basically, your career ends up spanning many doubling times of the economy, which basically means that your early life career skills are no longer as useful later on, which makes it less useful. So basically, typical emulation runs roughly 1,000 times the speed of a typical human. So the emulation world is growing very fast, doubling every month, for example. But from the point of view of the typical emulation, that's more like it's doubling every century. So from the point of view of a typical emulation, actually, their world is more stable and more slowly changing than your world is for you. But objectively, from a distance, of course, their world is changing very fast. And so humans, as they see the emulation economy double every month, they are amazed and confused and don't understand it very well. But they keep getting their checks from their stock returns, and they keep spending all that wealth. Next. So to summarize this Age of Em, you should understand that if your ancestors from 1,000 years ago had been asked to try to evaluate your world, and they had been told the basics of the Industrial Revolution, they would have been very confused. Your world is really pretty weird. And they would have found it hard to decide whether they liked or didn't like your world. It would probably depend on what was the first thing they heard about it, and they might give a too fast reaction. That's what I fear is the problem with telling you about the Age of Em. It's an entirely strange, different civilization, as strange as yours is different from the farmers and the foragers who came before you. You should not be very eager to make a quick judgment, but I know you're all eager to make a quick judgment, so let me tell you some quick summaries about the positives and negatives of this world. First, the emulations, positives, they have no pain, hunger, grit, disease. Their bodies are always beautiful, although that they live in the luxurious virtual reality. They're less afraid of death. They have a vast population who finds their lives worth living. They live in these huge, intricate cities. You may have said someday you couldn't live in a small town because there's not enough going on there. Well, that's what they say about your cities. Your cities are just way too small for them. They have this huge economy that can afford, they pay the fixed costs for great art and stories and other sorts of things that have high fixed costs, low marginal costs. They are at the level of ability of our people we praise most, our Nobel Prize winners, Olympic gold medalists, etc. That's the typical quality of the emulation, and the world is more stable. But on the negative side, it's a Malthusian world where they live at subsistence wages. Now, this isn't some theoretical thing. This is how most humans have ever lived, how pretty much all animals in history have ever lived. We know what happens when animals and humans live at subsistence wages. Basically, they do what it takes to survive, and that's what the Ems would do. They would work long hours. They would make these spur copies. There's probably going to be more inequality in wealth and speed and other things in this world. Bigger, more bureaucratic firms, perhaps less nature, less space travel, less democracy, more religion and ritual. But, this is the trade-off. And again, you shouldn't expect to be able to judge this very well. All right, next. Someday, the Age of Em might end. That is, during the Age of Em, there's going to be emulations and automation happening at the same time, but there'd be a back to the future moment. Next. So over time, in the past, we've seen jobs be displaced by automation. That is, almost always we've seen the transition only go in one direction. That is, we have a task that, say, a banker is doing or somebody else is doing, and initially a human is doing that task, and then soon afterwards, a machine is doing the task. And we almost never have the reverse thing where a machine is doing a task and then we switch it to have the human doing the task. And you might think that there'd be some as computer grows exponentially, there'd be some exponential displacement. But in fact, there's something called a log normal distribution, and it probably is what describes this distribution of cut points of how much power it takes to do a job with the computer, which explains why actually over many centuries we've had this relatively steady displacement of people with machines. The moment that Ems show up, Ems all of a sudden become a lot cheaper than humans. And so we have a Back to the Future moment where many tasks that were being done by automation were taken over by emulations. So human minds, which are the emulations on a computer, will be doing these tasks by hand from their point of view. But then over time, during the Age of Em, they will develop more better automation, and slowly their jobs will be displaced by machines. And so there's this long run question, will all the jobs be displaced by machines or not? Even for the emulations. That is, when we're having emulations competing with artificial intelligence and other sorts of computer automation, which of those wins in the long run? Next. Now, this is just a graph to show you that most citations are relatively small, and there's just a very few ones that are clumpy. And that's just to remind you that the vast majority of innovation is lots of small innovations, and only every once in a while do you have a huge one. I know a lot of people are imagining that there'll be this huge revolution, will be this enormous change all at once, but I think that's pretty unlikely. Most likely we'll just see a lot of slow progress. And so what we should expect to see is slowly automation gets better, and slowly Ems get better, and we want to know, how does that contest work out? Next. So biology did this interesting thing. For a long time, there were just single-celled animals. And then at some point, there was this evolutionary niche where multicellular animals or large organisms were possible. And evolution could have designed complicated large organisms, but what it did instead was packed lots of cells together to make a multicellular organism like you or I. And you have to realize that has enormous inefficiencies. Every one of these cells inside your body has basically most of the features and mechanisms necessary to float by itself out in the ocean, living by itself and defending itself. It has the ability to reproduce itself and has energy, manufacturing to make materials, and it just has all the different parts for a separately living creature. But now that it's in this big organism, it doesn't need most of those parts, but it still has them. Why? Well, because the point is that it's just easier to take this package that already works and put them together than it is to sort of redesign a whole big package. And that's a plausible way to think about the future after emulations. That is, human mind is this really nice package. It was really honed over a long time to be this nice package. And rather than sort of redesign this whole package at a larger scale, it might make sense to just take this package and pack them together like we do cells in a multicellular animal. And so for a while, at least, that is a potential way to think about Ems as a future. Ems become the cells in this larger multicellular mind, which is a larger mind contained of Ems. Next. And so you today are one brain in a sea of brains, one brain in a society, but over time, what we expect is that these emulations, since they're on computers now and you can edit them, the emulation world will try to edit the Ems, right? It'll try to redesign these brains, and it'll try to figure out how to make them better, but that will be hard because these are just packages that were evolved over a very long time. So brains today are this very well integrated package, but they're very dense with connections, and it's very hard to pull them apart into separate pieces that can function separately. But they are this amazing package, and maybe we should just leave this package alone. Now, no doubt, when you try to redesign the brain, you'll do some simple things. So, for example, if they don't need as big a vision, part of the brain, which is huge, to do most of their tasks, you might shrink the vision part. You might increase the size of other parts that maybe are more important. But still, it's this complicated thing, and you really can't change it that much. You might expand some size and shrink other parts, but you probably want to leave it together as a package. Next. So I want you to think about the difference between brains when it was evolving and code that we write today. So I did software engineering for 9 years as a research software engineer. So I have some experience writing code. And there's a key point that, brains the evolution design brains, there's a bunch of distinctions we use in what we call code that brains never came across. So brains don't distinguish hardware and software. They don't distinguish learning and doing, memory and processing, addresses and content. These are all very basic, important distinctions that we take a lot of advantage of when we design code, but brains never came across those. And so one of the key things is a brain has this limited size, and every new piece of software has to be packaged with a piece of hardware that goes with it to execute that software. And so if you want to add software to the human brain, you basically have to add more hardware to. That's what this little purple slot on the side represents. It's hard to add software to a brain. Once the brain is full up with software, in order to add a new thing, you have to take away an old thing, or you have to rearrange them somehow to make it more efficient, to make there room for a new thing. And because that was the situation with code or the brain, the evolution spent a very long time honing this package to be to abstract well and to generalize well in order to make room for all these different things it wants to cram in there, because it really just can't add things. Now, on the right-hand side of the screen here, you see when we write code, on the right-hand side, we just have libraries of old code, and then we can always start with a new blank screen and start to type new things in, and then we only connect the new things to the old things when we want to, but usually we don't. And so when we write code, we make it much less integrated, much less, very well organized and very well structured and very, abstracted, but we can write it much faster. We can write code really fast and make a lot of it, but our code basically is more fragile. It falls apart more quickly. And so this is a way of thinking about the relative advantages and disadvantages of brains, which would then become sort of the software that Ems are, but now it's online, but it's still at the same sort of organization, and the artificial code that Ems will write and that we have written so far as competing with the Ems. The key point is to say the brain code is less modular, it's less evolvable or changeable, but it's really great package. It's this really well-honed package, and it's a great package. And for the tasks it does well, it's probably going to be better than anything else for a very long time. But when you want to be able to make things much smaller than a brain, do tasks much smaller than a brain, change them quickly, throw things together quickly, then the code we write is the sort of code you want to use. And that will give you a sense of which kind of code will win where. So one of my main conclusions is emulation kind of code, I think, has a long future. Even when you have really advanced artificial intelligence and other kinds of code, it'll be able to do many kinds of things better than brains, but there will still be a lot of things that brains are good at that our artificial code is not for a long time. I can't tell you the entire future of trillions of years, but I can say after the age of ordinary Ems, there'll still be this long era where something like Ems will be valuable, and they will be competing and integrating with other kinds of software, but the human mind has a long future, I think. Next. So this is my last slide on these organized slides, and it's not as pretty, but again, to summarize, Ems and AI will eventually compete. And many people are under this assumption that AI will just beat out human mind software because they think human minds are just badly organized and badly structured. But I don't think that's true. I think the human mind is this marvel of integration, and it will last a long time compared to other less well-crafted packages. Human mind is the best at, we are really general and good when we devote an entire brain to a task and think about it in a high level of generality. But we have to do it sequentially and do that task. So it's only worth it for the tasks that are important enough to do that. We do some things in parallel, but those are only the things that have really been hard-coded in our heads to be able to do in parallel. We don't invent new things and do them in parallel much. But this brain code is ancient, and it does a lot of great stuff. And it will continue to have advantages, especially because it's a first mover and it gets the network advantages of already doing the task first. And so tasks will be organized around brains for a long time. And code has these other advantages, and you can even sort of test this by thinking about code cubed, which is what happens when we write code that goes cubed. It's even more fragile. It's even more, falls apart quickly. It doesn't generalize very well. It typically, has to be rewritten relatively quickly. But anyway, that's the end of my talk. So again, I quickly went over 4 areas. I told you about automation recently and in the near future and said not much is happening. I said for the next 30 years, remote work will be this really big deal. And that's what you should look forward to over the next 30 years. That will be the main driver, I think, in changing society. But on the scale of roughly a century, we'll see this huge change where the economy starts doubling every month instead of every 15 years. That's the Age of Em. I have this book about. I told you many weird things about it. But eventually the Age of Em would end, and I talked briefly at the end here about what happens when Ems compete with artificial software. Where does that go? And I said, I think Em-like software, modified, of course, in many ways, would have a long future. And that's my talk.
Robin, thank you so much. That was fascinating. And I know we've got a lot of questions for you. So our first question is, does brain emulation include emulation of consciousness too?
So this word consciousness has a lot of baggage, as you may know. So if you just mean sort of features of the fact that we can talk about ourselves and we can talk about what we remember doing and that we are aware of the fact that we're talking and remembering what we're doing, then a brain emulation will have all the same functional features as the original brain. So it can do everything the original brain can, at least from the point of view of observers. So it would argue that it is conscious and try to passionately persuade you that it is conscious just as much as you or I would. Because by definition, a brain emulation acts the same way the original would in the same situation. If it doesn't act the same way as the original would in the same situation, it's not a brain emulation. It's not a thing that emulates and does the same thing. Now, if you think, but I could be here talking to you and telling you that I feel like I have consciousness and telling you about all the functions I can perform, but not really be conscious. And if you want to say my real consciousness has nothing to do with my atoms or how they're organized or the chemical processes in my brain, it's this extra thing that's added on to my brain or my body or whatever. And there's no physical evidence that it's there. We just believe it's there and we're pretty sure it's there, except maybe when we're not. Then I'd say, well, for that extra thing, you don't know that I'm conscious. I don't know that you're conscious. We just kind of believe it. These emulations, you could believe it or not, but you know what? They believe it just like you do because they're an emulation of you and they would act the same way. And because they kind of run the world and you don't want to be rude to them, you'd probably, at least in public, take their word for it. You wouldn't insult them. You wouldn't tell them they're not conscious. They wouldn't like that. They would take that badly, just like you would if I told you you're not conscious. So as a social practical matter, everybody will treat them like they're conscious, whether they are or not.
Well, let me ask a follow-up question because there's a lot of research. There are great thinkers who think consciousness doesn't even reside in the brain. So if you're slicing and dicing the brain and emulating that, and consciousness somehow resides outside the body, I take it you don't subscribe to that theory. You think consciousness is located in the brain.
I think you are in your body. There's metaphorical senses in which you extend into your household, say, that you arrange things in your household, and that helps you get along with your life because it's structured to help you live. In that metaphorical sense, you live in your house, not just in your body, but basically you understand how you're really in your body. And I would say, like, physics is all there is, guys. And, all we've ever seen is the atoms we're made out of and how they're arranged. And that's what we have to work with here. If we ever saw anything else that was associated with brains that we could measure and deal with, then we need to include that in an emulation to make it work. So let's put it another way. If there's something that your brain is attached to that isn't in your brain, that it's hard to see, that's important for your brain functioning, then when we try to make an emulation, we'll fail. It won't work because we will have emulated only part of the system and we will have missed the other part of the system that we needed to make it work. So that would be a big clue that there's this other thing that we tried to make the brain work and it didn't work. My best is we won't need the other thing to make the brain work, but if I'm wrong, then we will find that out in the process of trying to make a brain emulation.
Okay, fair enough. All right, the next question is, do you think another race on another planet has achieved super AI? And if so, these aliens and their super AI will be able to create simulated worlds. So do you think we're in a simulation?
This is known as the simulation argument. It's a variation of it. Usually we think about our descendants simulating their ancestors and therefore us actually living in an ancestor simulation of our descendants. That's the usual simulation argument. I give that a few % chance, but not high chance. And I can go into that, but that's not really the main talk here. So you'll have to push and then I will answer that. But basically this question is asking about a, in some sense, less likely simulation where, say, we simulate not just our ancestors, but you can imagine when we can simulate things, we decide to simulate aliens. Just we make up different kind of aliens and we simulate them just to see what it's like. Now, we'll probably do a little bit of that. I just don't think we'll do very much of it. I mean, it's not that interesting and it's expensive. So my guess is we would do so little of it that the chance we're one of those is pretty small. So the way you think about it is to say, okay, it looks like I'm real here, but what if I'm not? What if the things I'm seeing aren't what I think they are? That's all a simulation. Well, what's the chance of that is just got to be counting. Well, how many real things are there compared to things who think they're in a real thing, but they're fooled, they're wrong. And if there's 1,000 of the first and 10 of the second, well, then there's only a 1% chance that we're in the second, because there's 10 out of 1,000. If there's 10 of the first and 1,000 of the second, then there's only 1% chance that it's like what we think it is. So basically, you just have to estimate the number of these things in order to make your guess about what's the chance we're in a simulation. So when I guess the numbers, I go, no, I don't think there's that many, aliens simulating strange civilizations just to see what it's like. I think that's not very interesting, and it's expensive, so they really wouldn't do it, even if they're super AIs and have lots of stuff, lots of money and power. I don't think it would be very interesting.
But wouldn't they experiment? I mean, if they achieve, there are mathematicians who think the probability of our being in a simulation is pretty darn high, even though we've not discovered that many habitable planets. But if aliens did create AI before we do, wouldn't they be experimenting, creating simulated worlds, and couldn't we be simulations? You just think that's unlikely.
Right. I mean, it's the could. So yes, the could is of course true. It's logically possible, but to guess the chances, we need to count numbers. It all comes to estimating the numbers. How many of this and how many of that? Whichever set is the bigger number, then that's the more likely scenario. So you make your bets about what are the numbers.
Okay. Well, I'm glad that's your conclusion. I was a little worried about that one. All right, here's one. Is it possible that an EM may decide not to work?
Yes, just to be clear, it's called M, short for emulations. So it's EM is like electromagnetism or something. EM stands for other things, but M is just the name for emulations. So yes, of course. We know what that's like. So as I said, most of human history, most people lived at a subsistence level. Most animals have lived at a subsistence level through all of biology for billions of years. We know what happens when a random animal or a random poor human decides not to work. You know what happens. For a little while, people around them say, "Oh, you," and they take care of them and they try to coax them back to work. But eventually, if the person is really stubborn and refuses to work, then either they're really loved and people still keep carrying them, or they're not really loved and they let them die. That's what happens. And so the same thing happens for Ems too. If they've got some money and they stop working, then they spend up their money. When they run out of money, then they get evicted by their landlord, basically. Their brain is being rented from some computer rack somewhere, and when they rent out of their rental money, then the brain gets evicted and erased and replaced by somebody else.
Okay, so they can be eliminated, unlike some of the fears about super AI being unboxed.
Well, I mean, these M's are collectively very powerful, but they're in this competitive economy where each one of them needs to work in order to survive. If you want to be afraid of them, being afraid of them together, they are in these large firms, powerful large firms and organizations who can do vast things if they want to. If you get on their wrong side, they could do a lot of things to you. But each one of them is in part of a big machine and a big system where each one of them needs to work to survive.
Okay, so here's a question from David. Why did the models project that Ems will be religious?
So again, to answer questions like this, we need to have some theory. We need to have our best theory of what religion does in our world and why it's there. So that's not a specialty area of mine, but it's certainly something I've read about. And again, my attitude in the whole book is just to go to the standard academic consensus, read what it says, and then apply it to this. So in that case, I say, what did the literature say? Why is religion there and what does it do? Well, the literature says, religion binds people together well. It takes a group of people and makes them depend on each other and be able to trust each other. And it also allows them to be in situations that are very scared and threatening and feel a little more comfortable and less scared. And it allows people to have more self-control, to do things that in their mind they think are what they should do, even though the rest of them is reluctant to do it. The world of Ems has need of these features. Emulations are in a weird world. So our world, as you already know, we're somewhat alienated from where we came from. Foragers are in a very natural environment that feels natural to them. Farmers were in a less natural environment, but they had to adapt. We are in an even less natural environment. Ems are even more so, and I'm sorry to say, the future looks like continued alienation, moving farther and farther away from the original environment we came from. So emulations will need to do these weird things in this weird world. They will be stressed, they will be uncertain, they will need comfort, they will need ways to produce self-control to adapt to new norms. And religion is this powerful tool that humans have developed that can achieve those things. So it's hard to imagine humans wouldn't continue to use that tool for those purposes when those purposes are needed. It's also worth noting that the Industrial Revolution was the last major, huge transition in human society, and all the world's major religions handled it just fine. We didn't invent a whole pile of new religions after the Industrial Revolution. We just took all the old religions and reinterpreted things a bit. That shows me religions are pretty robust. They really handle this stuff pretty well. They can probably handle the M transition just fine too.
Well, I'm gonna push back a little because I'm from the Oracle Institute with some science, with some good data. With regard to religion, people are leaving religion in droves. I mean, the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, are the largest category. Right. And humanism.
Yes, I agree.
Humanism is a growing trend in that people believe they could become more godlike. Yes. So couldn't EM get really...
Okay, but that's my forager-farmer chart. So I said, over the industrial era, we've seen this trend that as we get rich, we have had less religion. And I explained that in terms of becoming richer and becoming more forager life like during the industrial era. So I do think that trend will continue for the duration of humans in the industrial era. But the M era is a new era after that. And see, the key point is M's aren't rich anymore. We are rich and have been getting richer. And that's one of the main causes for most of our major social changes over the last century and would continue over the next century. And religion is one part of that trend. Again, less religion, more democracy, less fertility, more promiscuity, more leisure, more art. There's a lot of major trends over the last century or two that can be understood as moving in the forager direction. And of course, we people in this era, we like that, and we like to look forward to a future where that continues. And my warning is it doesn't have to continue if the next era after ours isn't full of rich people like us. M's are not rich is the key point. M's are poor, and poor people need comfort. Poor people need things to grasp onto to let them hold on to their culture's values and norms and to follow them even when they don't like it.
I guess applying some spiral dynamics here, you're equating the M's psychologically or yes. spiritually with pretty low level consciousness in the sense that, or let's use Maslow. Everybody knows Maslow.
Yeah, sure.
Are the M's just so desperate they never get beyond their sustenance needs and they just they're going to be slaves? I mean, you and I,
right? You and I look back, right? You and I look back at our ancestors 1,000 years ago, and we look at how they lived and what they thought. And we said, "Ew, what low creatures those people were." And we're so much better than they are. And why are we so much better? Well, we went to school, we learned all these things, and we can quote science. But the main reason we're different is we're rich.
I don't think I even agree with that. Once people hit the stage of wanting to self-actualize, money becomes irrelevant. What if all the EMs just rebel and want to self-actualize and bliss out? And let's say they do turn to not religion, but the higher form of religion, which is mysticism, and they just want to zen out.
So, we've only had industry where we're rich for a few hundred years, but we've had humans for 2 million years. So we have seen humans being spiritual and wanting to zen out for 2 million years. We know that story. It's happened over and over and over again for millions of years. What we see is that when poor people decide to be spiritual, they can do it in a small percentage of their lives over the campfire at night, around with their friends in their spare time, but they have to work or they starve. That is how humans have lived for a very long time. And that's the world in which they found spirituality and religion to be comforting and useful.
But aren't we cloning, essentially consciously cloning? You said Nobel laureates and the elite of the, I mean, if we're slicing and dicing massive brain power, why would they revert to being even remotely content with worrying about money? mean, those brains are driven by the desire to create.
So here's this key fact about my analysis.
Okay.
In a world of rich creatures, you have to know what they want to predict what they do. And so it's hard to predict a future of rich creatures because you have to know what they want. In a world of poor creatures, you don't have to know what they want to predict what they do, because you know that if they don't do what they need to do to not die, they die and go away. So you know how to predict what poor people do regardless of what they want. That's a nice, robust feature about predicting a poor world. That's why I can say so much more about the Age of Ems than I could say about our future when we get richer. So that's the key prediction.
Right.
How do you predict the future? If you just know what people can do, but you don't know what they want to do, then you can't say what they will do.
Well, I'm going to recommend that you learn a little bit about spiral dynamics and integral theory, because I think you're making some huge assumptions about what these great brains are going to regress into. I don't know that they're going to. Anyway, let's move on.
I will say I'm channeling the consensus of academia here. I'm just saying the usual things the usual experts would say. And maybe they're wrong, of course, but my job is just to put it all together and not to question all of it.
All right, here's one from Stephen. Are you familiar with the recent AI written article in The Guardian in which it claimed it will never be interested in destroying humanity, but only in observing us?
I did not read that particular article, but I have been around people who have been arguing this topic area for a long time. So I'm pretty sure I know what sort of things it might have said. And so basically, first of all, like, the space of possible minds is enormous. In that space is a vast range of possible creatures who could exist. It's hard to say much definitive about what any one creature will be like until you know where from that space it comes from. We will be able to make a lot of kinds of creatures. But one of the nice things about Ems is, because they're so much like humans, I can say so much more about them. I basically assume that they are psychologically like humans, have the same sort of emotions, inclinations, tendencies mentally, and then I go take that from there. Whereas if you say AI and you say, no, I don't mean an emulation, I mean something artificial, and then if you don't say more about that, now it's this vast space of who knows what it could be. So yes, in this space, there are creatures who don't care about us, they just want to watch us. But you know what? In that space, there's also things who want to kill us. And in that space, there's things who love us and want to make us happy. That space is huge. It contains lots of variations. So, in order to make any progress, we have to have some theory about which creatures in that space would be realized and, why they would show up when. So the way I would do that is to say, well, imagine a continued competitive capitalist economy where firms make AIs in order to make money. Now that narrows it down. I can say, well, the kinds of AIs firms will make to make money will be the following sorts. And then we can talk about it. And I can say, you know what? Firms, when they make money by selling AIs to customers, they probably won't be selling AIs to kill people. That won't be the usual case, at least. Otherwise, they won't make much money. And customers won't like that, So, if I can assume that there'll be this larger competitive economy where firms make AIs to make products and services, then I'm going to assume, these firms might be part of a nation that goes to war with each other, and they might not give you a job if they don't like the way you work. But if you've got money and you're buying a service from them, and that's a service with an AI, the AI probably do what you want, because that's how the system works.
All right, here's the next question. How does learning evolve if copies of Ems won't always retain memories, like in your celebrity example?
Right, so remember I talked about, you make copies during the day who do some side tasks, and then you go on to the next day. So one of the trade-offs is these side copies, they're much more effective in the sense that every hour is basically 1 hour of work and you don't have to pay for them to rest. But one of the costs is they don't learn so much. That is, it's the mainline copy of what you do there that makes you learn more. And so there's a trade-off of doing things to learn them versus doing things to get done. Most of us know by the time we're, say, mid-career that we're doing a lot of things, not so much to learn, but to get things done. And so we'd be able to make that trade-off. You would say, okay, look, this task looks like important. I need to do this myself so I can learn how to do it. I can learn more things about it. You know what, this other task, I've done that 10 times before. I'm pretty sure what that is. Let's just make a copy and get it done. And, that's the trade-off.
Okay, next question. Are you predicting that everyone will eventually have the ability to make a personal EM? Or only rich people, or only, yeah.
So the key idea is Ems cost money. initially they're really expensive. And so the age of M doesn't start until Ems are cheap enough that they can replace human workers en masse. At the point where they're cheap enough, there's two kinds of costs. There's the cost to scan a human to make an M and the cost to keep the M running. I think the cost of scanning will be relatively low compared to the cost of running the Ems. And so as soon as emulations are cheap enough to compete with a human, that means if you have enough money to like live and not starve, you probably also have enough money to make an M. The problem is initially Ems will be destructive. That is, the scanning that makes an M will destroy the brain in the process of making the emulation. That's a little detail I didn't tell you about. It's kind of discouraging, but for a while at least, you can't make an M unless you become an M and you give up being a human. Eventually, that will not be the problem. Eventually, you can make the scan of the brain and the brain gets left alone, but that'll be a little while later and you'll have to wait for that. This is a problem in the early M because I didn't tell you that initially, the M world, we were looking for the best adult humans who are the best at their jobs, but pretty soon they will want young humans who are flexible and can learn to do the M jobs. So the M world will be going around looking for human 5-year-olds to destructively scan and turn into Ems to recruit into the M world. And you can see how there could be some problems with that.
Okay, this is getting darker the more we get into it.
Yes, so it's a strange world.
Could there be people who just say, okay, slice and dice my brain, basically committing suicide because they think they'll live on in their M?
Yes, in fact, the Ems will tell them, yes, look, we're here, we're alive, we have a good life, come join us, yes. And if you believe they're just ghosts and fake creatures, you'll be terrified by this image of these very articulate, very persuasive Ems showing you their beautiful virtual world and all the things you can do there and all the light and the immortal life you will have there and how it's so much cheaper to be there. Like for the price of being one human who can barely survive at subsistence, you can afford 1,000 Ems who have virtual reality and live immortal lives, right? So if you're convinced that they really are there and that they really are conscious and they really have a life, then yes, it's tempting. And it's so tempting. The Ems will be, look, the Ems will say, you're this human and you want charity to stay and be a human because otherwise you're starved, but you could just become one of us. Why don't you just become one of us? You're a lot cheaper to take care of if you just become one of us. Why should we pay for you to stay being this expensive human?
Yeah, but all they do is work all day. They live in a room with the desk.
No. The typical emulation works all day, but if you have enough money to turn from being a human to be an M, that particular M doesn't have to work a day of his life.
Okay.
It's just if they want to make lots of copies.
Now we're talking about perpetual virtual reality for the wealthy, basically.
Right. So it can be your heaven that you get to have immortality in this luxurious heaven, as long as you don't want to make many copies of yourself. But the M world will be wanting to make many copies. So most Ems will be the copies who work a lot, but a few of them will be the rich, ex-humans who decided to not make copies and stay rich and leisure.
Will they be networked? Can the slave Ems attack the Ems who are living this perfect existence?
Well, okay, of course, I don't recommend slavery, but slavery is not impossible. Slavery has never been impossible. Slavery is not impossible in your or my world. We could be slaves tomorrow. That's logically possible. Hopefully that doesn't happen. So
hopefully
I can't tell
you either with this new Supreme Court pick. All right, next question. I know there's more. Okay, no, that was the last one. If Ems network and redesign themselves, how can we predict their behavior after the initial, well, it's not really programming, after the initial brain scan?
So the key thing, again, as you note, an emulation does the same thing the original would in the same situation, but now they have a different life, they live in a different world, and therefore they change and become something different. So if you have a child and it grows up in your world, you can predict what their life will be like more than, say, if they move to China or to Japan or somewhere else. There's a different culture and they live in a different place with different people. Well, you'll find it harder to predict what they do and what they become because they live in a different world. That's the Ems. The Ems are only different from you or I because they live in a different world, because they have a different environment that has different incentives and different things they can do. That's what changes them. So we can predict them as well as we can predict any human in a strange society, which is only somewhat. Right? If we made a strange society in Antarctica with a bunch of strange rules and a bunch of strange processes, could we predict what it would do in 10 years or in a century? Somewhat, maybe not.
So they could become as dangerous potentially as AI run amok, super AI run amok.
Well, they're going to start right out being humans, and humans are already as dangerous as humans. So, you're starting right out from the beginning of being dangerous.
AI
I mean, come
is
on.
better than Ems at this point.
Humans are dangerous, for goodness sake. Look, you must have seen these humans around before. These humans, they look calm and they look pleasant and they talk charming, but you know what? They can pick up guns and they've got bombs and they can do all sorts of stuff.
All right, so when I wrote this question, now I'm thinking the opposite is the case, but I had written, isn't AI less predictable than the Ems? But if the Ems are more like humans, the Ems must be more unpredictable.
Well, again, if you had a specific kind of AI, then we could predict it better. But when you just say AI, that's just the category of everything that isn't human.
Right.
It's this vast space of possibilities. So if you tell me you don't know where in that space it is, it's just going to be somewhere. Well, I got to say, well, that's pretty hard to predict. I mean, come on, you got to give me something. So if you tell me it's made by competitive firms trying to make a profit or something, you give me some structure like that, then I can use that to predict things. But honestly, Ems are more predictable because, look, we've been around humans for a long time. Yes, humans do unpredictable things, but we have specialized in figuring out what humans do. If there's any kind of mind, we know what they do. It's humans. We know humans better than tigers or squirrels or any other kind of mind, really. So we're really best placed to predict human minds, I think. And Ems are a lot like human minds, so I would say they are definitely easier to predict than other sort of strange minds.
Okay, here's a question. Is there a possibility that we are primitive Ems? And, well, this had been asked before, but do you think we're currently living in a simulation?
Well, let me elaborate on my reasoning. So the usual reason for living in a simulation is the one you're alluding to, which is the idea that if we continue on the path we're going, then eventually our descendants will be more powerful and capable than us. And those descendants will have an interest in history, just like we do. And so when they study their history, one of the ways they would study it is actually make simulations of history in the ways that we make mild simulations of our history sometimes. We do movies and video games and plays, and also, try to think it in our head. They would make actual simulations of their past. So if we're sitting in something that looks like 2020, it's logically possible that this is not really 2020. This is a simulation done in 2120. Trying to ask what is 2020 like by doing a simulation. That's logically possible. So now the question is, what's the chance that that's actually true of you right now? That's where you have to do the numbers. You have to say, okay, how many people are there in 2020? 7 billion. How many people are there in the future who are in a simulation who think they're in 2020? That's the key number. If that number is more than 7 billion, then you know what? Yeah, you're probably in the future. If that number is way less than 7 billion, okay, you're probably here. You need to estimate that number. That's the key number. So when I estimate that number, I say, well, when I look into the past, how quickly does our interest in simulating the past decline? And I say our interest in simulating the past and learning about the past declines much more quickly than population does. So over the last 10,000 years, population doubled roughly every 1,000 years. And I say our interest in the past goes down by half much more quickly than 1,000 years. If you go from, say, 1,500 to 500, that's much less than half of interesting. If you go from 500 to minus 500, that's even much less than 500. Our interest in the past falls really, really fast away from us. We are interested in us. We are interested in stuff that made us, stuff that contributed to us, influenced us. You go farther in the past, you can't see stuff that influenced us. We just lose our interest. They're not like us. They didn't influence. Who cares about them? And so I'd say that's true. When we look at these people in the future who can simulate their past, we want to ask, who are they interested in simulating? And I got to say, we're not the top of the list. We are not the center of the world's history attention. Everybody thinks they're the center of the world. Everybody thinks the future's all interested in them. But you know what? Nope. Future's not going to be that much more interested in simulating you than you are interested in simulating 500 AD. Have you ever read a novel about 500 AD? Have you ever looked at a movie about 500 AD? Do you have any idea who was doing what in 500 AD? No, you don't, because you don't care.
Well, actually, I do like history, but I actually do like history. And you're obviously not an Outlander fan. But the women out there who are in love with it, Jamie, they like going back to Scotland 200 years ago. Anyway, this has been fascinating and fun. And Robin, thank you so much. I think that was our last question, and we're right up on.
Very good timing. All right. Got it all settled.
It was perfect. Thank you so much. And we will.
And I hope someday I can do another meeting where I see you guys in person and see some faces and some idea, what's going on. I'm
All
hoping you
right.
were paying attention, not falling asleep. I don't know, but I can't see from here. It's just I'll see the screen.
You are riveting. All right.
All
Well,
right.
thank you to our audience for joining us, and we'll see you at the next
Take
BTNW
care.
session, which is going to be Sector 11, Spirituality and Religion. So good night, everybody.